Hello, EE Scholars! Welcome to lesson number 4 of the Ecology and Evolution series. Today, we'll be going over different types of learning, namely associative and non-associative, 3 Nobel Prize winners that relate to the scope of this class, the optimal foraging theory, the interactive theory of development, and supernormal stimuli. So, there are 2 different types of learning, associative learning and non-associative learning. Associative learning is defined as a behavior that is modified or conditioned through association. In short, an organism's behavior changes based on the association it makes between 2 different things. We'll see an example of this in a little bit. There are 2 different types of associative learning, classical or Pavlovian conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the paired presentation of 2 different kinds of stimuli in a way that causes the organism to form an association between the 2 stimuli. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is an organism's association between its own behavior and punishment or reward. Now we move on to non-associative learning. Non-associative learning is defined as learning that does not require stimuli association or pairing. In this class, we only have one type of non-associative learning, habituation. Habituation is when an organism experiences a decrease in response, usually on a subconscious level, to specific stimulus that has no positive or negative consequences. First, we're going to look at associative learning, which is where our 2 forms of conditioning reside. But before that, there are some abbreviations you may want to know. When talking about conditioning, people may use the abbreviations US, UR, CS, CR, or NS. US stands for unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that does not evoke any unnatural responses. In other words, if I were to present, let's say, a dog with food and it only salivated, which would be a normal response, then that food is an unconditioned stimulus. UR stands for unconditioned response. When I present the dog with food, the unconditioned stimulus, then its unconditioned or natural response would be to salivate. Now, CS and CR are where we start to mix things up. CS stands for conditioned stimulus. Let's go back to the example of food and the dog salivating. Now, let's say that we introduce a bell, and we want to make the dog salivate whenever it hears the bell. So, for the next so often, we ring the bell every time we bring the dog food. Finally, one day, we ring the bell without the food, but the dog salivates anyway because of its association between the bell and the food. In this case, the bell would be a conditioned stimulus. It now evokes a response that is not natural for the dog. Likewise, the dog's salivation when it hears the bell would be its conditioned response, or CR. Last but not least, NS stands for neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that at first produces no response. So before the bell became a conditioned stimulus, it was a neutral stimulus. So if you've never heard of a certain Russian scientist associated with classical conditioning, then you probably wondered where I got my previous example from. Well, it's actually a pretty famous experiment that was conducted by Ivan Pavlov in the 1890s. Just like I said in my example, Pavlov presented dogs with food while he rang a bell, and the dogs learned to associate the smell of the food, which made them salivate, with the ringing of the bell. It eventually got to a point that Pavlov could ring the bell without presenting food, and the dogs would still salivate. But enough of that. What are some of the traits of classical conditioning as a whole? Well, there's a couple of key things to know. First, classical conditioning is focused on pairing 2 stimuli. There is a response that follows, yes, but that response is only a result of the organism's unnatural association between 2 different kinds of stimuli. This distinction will be important when we get into the other type of conditioning. Another key aspect of classical conditioning is that it is involuntary. In Pavlov's experiment, dogs didn't get to choose whether they wanted to salivate or not. It was just their response. So remember this, classical conditioning involves involuntary behavior and stimulus-stimulus pairing. Operant conditioning was a term coined by B.F. Skinner in 1937. In his famous experiment, Skinner made a contraption that he called Skinner's box, a box with a little lever inside, and placed a mouse in said box. When the mouse accidentally pressed a lever, it was rewarded with food. This led the mouse to press the lever more and more. Another variation of Skinner's box had the mouse receive mild electric shocks. Only when the mouse pressed the lever would the shocks stop. This, as one could expect, also led the mouse to press the lever more and more. As you've probably noticed, this type of conditioning differs from classical conditioning. First, operant conditioning is focused on the association between stimulus and response. If the mouse wanted food or release from electric shocks, the stimulus, then it would have to press the lever, response. Another difference is that operant conditioning requires voluntary action. If the mouse wanted to, it could have chosen to not press the lever. Pressing the lever was a conscious choice. Of course, if it chose to not press the lever, then it would face consequences such as not getting food. But in the end, it still made a voluntary decision to press the lever. Pressing it did not become a subconscious response such as it would be in classical conditioning. Here are the key differences between the two types of conditioning. While operant conditioning is voluntary, classical conditioning is involuntary. And while operant conditioning focuses on the association between stimulus and response, classical conditioning focuses on the association between two different kinds of stimuli. Finally, in the end, both types of conditioning are forms of associative learning. Habituation, however, is a form of non-associative learning. Remember, non-associative learning does not require stimuli association or pairing. Habituation, as stated before, is a decrease in response to a specific stimulus that has no negative or positive consequences. So, if you'd like to skip down to the example, a bird learning to ignore leaves that fall from trees would be an example of habituation. Stimulus filtering, the big chunk of text above the example, is the mechanism of habituation. In short, stimulus filtering is the brain's way of focusing on useful information and ignoring not useful information. Alright, time for some practice. A child eats shrimp for the first time and gets sick without being allergic. However, they come to associate the food with their sudden illness anyway. From then on, every time they see or smell shrimp, it sparks a feeling of dislike. What type of learning is this, associative or non-associative? If it's associative, what type of conditioning is it? This was an example of classical conditioning. First and foremost, there was a pretty obvious association going on between the shrimp and the illness. So it's safe to say that this is some form of associative learning. But how do we know it's classical conditioning and not operant conditioning? Perhaps the biggest clue was that the child's feelings, the CR, were involuntary. The child didn't choose to feel disgusted at the sight of the food. They simply did because of their past experiences. Also, the conditioned response was produced by a pairing between two stimuli. The food was associated with the illness, which then produced a feeling of being sick, and that ultimately led to the child disliking shrimp. Let's try another example. Clara starts wearing a new perfume. At first, she smells it constantly, but as time goes on, she notices the smell less and less until she doesn't even notice it at all. What type of learning is this, associative or non-associative? If it's associative, what type of conditioning is it? It was habituation. In the example, Clara didn't form any associations to anything, so it had to be some form of non-associative learning. And the only form of non-associative learning that we've discussed is habituation, which is learning to not react to a stimulus. In this situation, not reacting to a stimulus is exactly what Clara did, making this a perfect example of habituation. A veteran from the Great War has developed PTSD because of his experiences in the Army. Things that trigger him to have flashbacks include crowded events and unexpected touches. What type of learning is this, associative or non-associative? If it's associative, what type of conditioning is it? Take some time to think about it. This was an example of classical conditioning. In the example, the veteran formed an association between the things he saw while in the Army and crowded events/unexpected touch. This association is, for better or worse, involuntary and cannot be controlled. As such, this is classical conditioning. A student gets a good grade on their exam and their parents praise them for it. This motivates the student to do well on their next exam too. What type of learning is this, associative or non-associative? If it's associative, what type of conditioning is it? This was operant conditioning. First, there was an association between two things, in this case, doing well in school and praise. We already know that an association between two things has to be associative learning. Doing well in school is also a response, while praise is a stimulus. So that points us in the direction of operant. The example also stated that the child wanted to do well on their next exam, a voluntary action, which helps us solidify this example as operant. Okay, last example. In his house, Greg's garbage container has started to smell bad due to the rotting food inside. Greg promptly takes the trash out. What type of learning is this, associative or non-associative? If it's associative, what type of conditioning is it? This was also operant conditioning. First off, there was an association, taking out the trash and no more smell. Second, there was an emphasis between a stimulus, the smell, and a response, taking out the trash. Finally, taking out the trash was voluntary and ended in a reward, no more smell. So this was definitely an example of operant conditioning. Now we move on to our 3 Nobel Prize winners. The 3 that you'll need to know for this class are Lorenz, von Frisch, and Tinbergen. Lorenz is most famous for his discovery of imprinting. Imprinting is a form of learning in which a very young animal, usually a baby, fixes its attention on the first object it has visual, auditory, or tactile experience and thereafter follows that object. All of that was just a fancy way to say that a baby thinks the first thing it sees or interacts with is its mom. Lorenz demonstrated this idea of imprinting through the use of geese. In his experiment, Lorenz hatched baby geese and made sure that he was the first thing they saw. The geese then imprinted on him, thought he was their mom, and followed him around. Wouldn't that be cool? Lorenz also repeated the experiment with a different set of geese imprinting on a shoe. Remember, the first thing they visually, auditorily, or tactily experience doesn't have to be alive. Von Frisch is famous for his work with bees. He was the first to decode what is known as the bee waggle dance. You see, bees communicate with each other in a sort of dance, and von Frisch figured out what they were saying. As it turns out, bee dances are fairly complex. Not only do forager bees come back and tell the others that they found food, they can get as specific as telling them the distance and direction of said food through specific movements. They can even get as nitpicky as the quality of the nectar-rich flower patch. Isn't that cool? Well, I think it is. Finally, we have Tinbergen. Tinbergen is known for a couple of things, namely the adaptive function of behavior and behavioral ecology. The adaptive function of behavior is defined as how behavior allows an animal to stay alive and keep its offspring alive. For an example, let's take a look at one of Tinbergen's own experiments. While observing gulls, Tinbergen noticed that the mothers would put hatched eggs away from their nest. Naturally, he wondered why. So Tinbergen made an experiment where he put different colored eggs in an area with predators. Some eggs were the color of gull eggs, while others had the color on the inside of those eggs, white. Tinbergen found that while some eggs of both colors got eaten, the white ones were eaten more frequently. Tinbergen eventually concluded that the gulls took hatched eggs away from their nests because those eggs now showed the white color on the inside, and that would attract predators. So the adaptive function of the mother gull's behavior would be that it keeps predators from locating their nests. Tinbergen is also associated with behavioral ecology. Behavioral ecology is the study of how natural selection shapes an organism's behavior. For example, take Tinbergen's experiment with male sticklebacks. Male sticklebacks are very territorial and will attack other male sticklebacks that wander into their territory. Now, for those who don't know anything about sticklebacks, I didn't at first. Male sticklebacks have a red underbelly while females have more of a gray underbelly. Tinbergen wanted to test what it was that male sticklebacks used to identify one another. Was it the red underbelly, or was it the different shape between the sexes? So he did an experiment where he introduced various shapes, some red, some not, into the stickleback's territories. What he found was that the male sticklebacks specifically targeted the models that were painted red. So if we're going back and relating this to behavioral ecology, then we could say that the mating selection pressure and territoriality of male sticklebacks has made them aggressive towards red. Okay, we just have a few more things left to go. So first, the optimal foraging theory. This theory states that natural selection favors individuals whose foraging behavior is as energetically efficient as possible. Let's take a look at an example. Here we have a chart that shows the energy this shore crab receives from eating different sizes of mussels. As you can see, the smallest mussels don't provide much energy, but the biggest ones don't either. Why is that? Well, think about it. The bigger the mussel, the more work it takes to crack open. And if you're using all of the calories you'd get from eating it just to open it, it's not that energetically efficient. The optimal foraging theory would say here that natural selection would favor the crabs who sought medium-sized mussels since that's where their intake is highest. The interactive theory of development says that development requires both genetic information and environmental inputs. So I'm sure that you've all heard of nature versus nurture, right? Well, this theory is saying that it's actually nature and nurture. So, for example, say that we have someone who's a valedictorian. All of their life, they've been pretty good at school, and they understand class material easily just because of how their brain works. That's nature. But they also wanted to be valedictorian because they've been told by their parents and friends that it's a high honor. That's nurture. So, in the end, they're the valedictorian because of a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Finally, we have what's known as a supernormal stimulus. A supernormal stimulus is just a fancy way to say an exaggerated science stimulus or a stimulus that is larger or more intense than other stimuli. So, for example, look at this versus that. Which one caught your eye first? Probably that, right? In this example, that is a supernormal stimulus because it's so much larger than this. Here are a few more examples of supernormal stimuli. On the right, we have a peacock. Notice how bright and loud its feathers are. And under that, there's a bird with 3 eggs. The largest egg that's under the bird, if you can see it, is the supernormal stimulus because it overshadows the other ones just so much by sheer size. And lastly, we have junk food. Remember, supernormal stimuli aren't just about size. They can also be more intense. Junk food is a lot more intense than many other things like fruits and vegetables, and that's why it's so popular. Alright, today we went over quite a bit. To review, there are 2 types of learning, associative and non-associative. The 2 types of associative learning are classical and operant conditioning, while the 1 type of non-associative learning is known as habituation. For this class, the 3 important Nobel Prize winners are Lorenz, known for imprinting, von Frisch, known for his discoveries over the bee waggle dance, and Tinbergen. Recall his experiments with gulls and sticklebacks. We went over 2 theories. The optimal foraging theory is concerned with foraging behavior that is as efficient as possible. The interactive theory of development states that behavior is a combination between nature and nurture. And finally, a supernormal stimulus is a stimulus that is exaggerated just like so. Well, that concludes our 4th lesson for ecology and evolution. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.